All right, welcome back to the channel. So it appears as if Floyd Mayweather Jr. is back in negotiations with the with MMA or the UFC for a fight. That's what Dana White had to say. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back, welcome back. So we are back to this great distraction, but I will cover it because that's what it is right now in boxing, man. We're getting a lot of Floyd Mayweather Jr., Roy Jones Jr., Mike Tyson, Jake Paul, KSI, all kind of fights taking place, dude, that ain't got nothing to do truly with the best being with us watching the best fighters in the world. Because that is not Floyd Mayweather Jr. is not that anymore. Roy Jones Jr. is not that anymore. Mike Tyson is not that anymore. Jake Paul, get out of here. Just, you know what I mean? It's like sideshow Bob time in boxing. And not all of it is bad. I'm going to support, for sure, going to support Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr. Hey, man, if them dudes can get that cake, get the cake. I got no problem with that. But it is, a bit of a distraction for the sport from, some of the bigger fights, some of the really, really good fights that we have coming up, right? But, not to be surprised, not surprisingly at all, the trend of the exhibition kind of fake fight type of stuff is continuing, and more than likely it's going to continue for a while, until somebody just really, really flops, or, somebody really takes over the sport of boxing. Something that Deontay Wilder was right there to do. But unfortunately, he got in there with a guy with a loaded glove, a very good fighter with loaded gloves, with loaded gloves hanging off of his hand, the WBC not standing up for him, the Nevada State Athletic Commission letting people in with gloves like that, but then again, also Tyson Fury being a very good fighter, right? So that did not happen. And so right now we don't really have anybody in boxing that's transcending the sport. And since we don't have anybody that transcends the sport, there's a big gap. So for boxing fans that want to see people that transcend the sport, right? What can they watch? They can only watch a Floyd Mayweather Jr. fight, McGregor fight, or Tanahashi or whatever, or Roy Jones Jr. Those guys are people whose names are known by everybody. So if it comes up, they may want to go see it, right? Where the fighters that we have that are very, very good fighters have not really reached that level yet. Now, I have my reasons why I believe fighters that nobody has been able to fill that gap. I'll give whatever, man. We're in the middle of this conversation, so I'll give it, dude. It's just, hey, man, American fighters are not getting pushed. American fighters are not getting pushed. Now, people can argue about who the best fighters are and who the best fighters are not, but you cannot argue about who is getting the push and who is not getting the push. There are plenty of fighters that are very, very good that get no push. And there are fighters that are not very good, that aren't very good, that get a lot of push, right? That's what the hype job is. A promoter hyping you up. But a lot of times, dude, that hyping up the hyping up of somebody is designed to get them to the level where their name becomes ubiquitous in the boxing community, the use of their name becomes ubiquitous in the sports world in general, right? But it's not going to happen. That doesn't always happen, and it has not happened for like Vasily Lomachenko. They try it with Vasily Lomachenko, not happening for Vasily Lomachenko. They tried it for Gennady Golovkin, didn't happen for Gennady Golovkin, not going to happen for Gennady Golovkin. They're trying it now with Tyson Fury, didn't happen for Tyson Fury, not going to happen for Tyson Fury. Tried with Vladimir Klitschko, didn't happen for Vladimir Klitschko, not happening for Vladimir Klitschko, not happening for Vitaly Klitschko, because they are not central to the boxing idea in the identity of the United States. There's a certain dynamic that they do not bring to the United States that other fighters do. For example, and then I'll get to the Floyd Mayweather. Don't wait, the Floyd Mayweather Jr. stuff is coming on, but there's a purpose for this video, because Floyd Mayweather Jr. in and of himself going to fight somebody like Khabib over there in the UFC That's no problem for that's marketing for UFC. You know what I mean? That market's for the UFC. But there's no problem in and of itself for Floyd Mayweather Jr. doing that. It's not Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s fault, or it is Floyd Mayweather Jr. It's to Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s credit that he did ascend to the level that he ascended to, right? But who are the other people in the past that have come anywhere near elevating where getting to the point where Floyd Mayweather Jr. is, right? With his name being bigger than the sport of boxing. The last person before that, maybe somebody could say Oscar De La Hoya, but no, I don't think Oscar De La Hoya ever made it to. No, he never made it to where Floyd Mayweather Jr. was, but he was up there. But he fought a lot of Black American fighters. He fought Bernard Hopkins. He fought Shane Mosley. He fought Pernell Whitaker, right? So he's out there. Even when he was building himself with fighters from America, right? Whose name had cachet and respect in the United States. But since boxing since Don King has left the sport of boxing, there's not another promoter that is really willing and able to put American fighters in the forefront, because that is not the mission of Top Rank, who is a major promoter. The PBC, the main guy behind the PBC, is not a promoter. He doesn't speak in public. So it's just that gap has not been filled. So since the gap has not been filled, Floyd Mayweather Jr. remains where he is, the biggest money maker, the biggest money-making boxer in the world. And he is still that. Floyd Mayweather Jr. doesn't have to fight. He's not fighting professional fighters, but I promise you, if he goes to fight Khabib, he's going to make more money fighting Khabib in a boxing match and beating up Khabib than anybody in the sport of boxing is going to make off of any fight. There's literally no fight in boxing right now where somebody, if you don't bring in some mafia dude to money launder, right? To money launder through the use the fight to money launder, right? And put up a bunch of money, right? But if you're talking about people selling tickets and pay-per-views being bought, dude, nobody is going to be able to pull off what Floyd Mayweather Jr. would pull off with Khabib, right? But that's because Floyd Mayweather Jr. is the number one American fighter. He's actually the number one fighter in the world, but he got to that status. Now, Floyd Mayweather Jr. thinks that he is the first guy, or acts like he acts like he's the first guy to do everything, right? But that's just I think because he just doesn't have much of a vision into the past, right? Like, maybe he doesn't know that, first of all, exhibitions were huge in the 1700s and the 1800s. And it is really the way that a lot of fighters actually made their money. They didn't make a lot of their money in the actual fights that they made. They would have because boxing was illegal. So say like a Tom Melanor and Tom Cribb in the 1790s, they fought each other. But then what do they do? What's the guy? I forgot what was the guy's the Black Terror, Bill Richmond. That's what they would do. They would have an illegal fight, right, off in the country somewhere, and then people would be gambling on it. They would make their money, and then for the next 5 or 6 months, they would go tour around, do exhibitions where they really wouldn't actually punch each other, but they would be going through the motions of the fight to replay the fight for other people. So exhibitions are as old as exhibition boxing matches as old as boxing is, regardless. So if he fights Khabib or somebody else, like, I have to suppose, I'm not as big on MMA as I am on boxing, so I couldn't tell you who the people are that he would be thinking about fighting, but yeah, he would be able to make a lot of money in that, man. But all of that would come to an end if people, in my opinion, if the media and boxing promotions on the world level started really pushing and standing behind American fighters. People spend so much of the marketing dollars that are spent on boxing, right? Like the marketing dollar from Top Rank, the marketing dollar that's getting spent for DAZN, the marketing dollars that are being spent by Oscar De La Hoya. Well, that's ESPN, but just say ESPN and DAZN. All of that marketing dollar, all that money getting pushed forward, and very little of it being spent to push American fighters. in an American market. And that's why we're sitting with this scenario where the most exciting thing in boxing to a lot of people is a 54-year-old and a 51-year-old. Yeah, Roy Jones Jr. turns 52 in January. And I do believe, I don't remember when Mike Tyson's birthday is, but he's 54. So, you're talking about combined age of 100. You're looking at 106 years of life experience in the boxing ring. And that's the biggest thing in boxing. Why? Because of all the marketing money that was spent on them, right? And the fights that were made by them in the 1980s and the 1990s, right? Put the money behind behind several American fighters, and you will see American boxing, American fight fans from the areas that those fight fans live in, tuning in to watch on TV, tuning in, looking at the advertisements and for the advertisers that are paying for it, right? They're going to get the subscription and all of that stuff. That's why Gervonta Davis, one of the things that I'm not running, I got a little time on this. Like, for example, Best Fight the Best Boxing brought up an example of why he didn't think that Gary Russell Jr. versus Gervonta Davis could be made in either Baltimore or Washington. He said, because there would be so much drama around the fight that people might start going, that people get really invested in it. And there could be some violence that would take place peripheral to the fight, right? So he's like, nah, don't do that. Do that somewhere else. And I think that that's very real, but it tells you that there is a connection between the fighters, right? Gervonta Davis, who's from Baltimore, and Gervonta Davis, who's from DC, that they have real connections to those cities. And those cities themselves, both of them have together. I'm not sure if Baltimore, I'm sure Baltimore has over 1 million people, but those areas, there's millions of people in those areas that would tune into a fight if that fight was aired in Dallas, or, if it was, the fight took place in Dallas, but was, it was obviously aired in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. You look at that's why Terrence Crawford, despite the fact that he is not publicized nearly as much as Tyson Fury or Lomachenko, still does better numbers, still does better viewership numbers than either one of them, because he's American. But, but for some reason, certain Americans just don't get the push. But that's my take on the matter. Hey man, but boxing's loss is UFC's gain. Boxing's loss is Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s gain, so they can go ahead and make that money. Boxing's loss, active boxers' loss, is Roy Jones Jr. and Mike Tyson's gain, because hey man, since they don't have any real fights that they're interested in, because people aren't selling the fights to them. Hey, let's get a mythical matchup. I'll take anything. Give me the mythical matchup. Anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think, and with that, I'm out. Peace.